The barbed wire cut deeper with each desperate attempt to break free, blood trickling down the young colt's legs and staining the forest floor beneath him. His once shining chestnut coat now dulled with dirt and dried blood, ribs visible through his skin. The foal's eyes reflected a fading will to live. Tied cruelly to an ancient oak deep in the forgotten woods, the young horse had been left to die, a deliberate act of cruelty, hidden away where no one would witness his suffering. Days had passed, his strength diminishing with each sunrise, his whinnies for help growing weaker, until they were barely more than ragged breaths. This was no accident. Someone had meticulously wrapped that barbed wire, ensuring the young colt would endure a slow, agonizing death in complete isolation. The forest stood indifferent to his suffering, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden shafts that illuminated his misery with unforgiving clarity. Each morning birds awakened with cheerful songs that seemed to mock his plight, their freedom a stark contrast to his torment. At first he had fought fiercely against his binding, each struggle only driving the rusted metal deeper into his flesh, creating wounds that now festered under the relentless summer heat. Flies gathered around him, their incessant buzzing a constant reminder of his approaching fate. The young colt's story should have ended there. Another silent tragedy buried within the depths of the woodland. His head now hung low, touching the earth that would soon reclaim him. His breathing had become shallow, labored, each inhale a battle hardly worth fighting. The spark that once lit his eyes had dimmed to near extinction. Time blurred as consciousness faded in and out, reality melting into fevered dreams of open meadows and his mother's protective presence. Nature continued its indifferent cycle around him. Squirrels chattered overhead, deer cautiously stepped through distant clearings. A fox paused briefly to consider the dying creature before continuing on its path. The forest did not mourn. It simply absorbed his suffering as it had countless others before him. The young colt had no concept of cruelty or mercy, only of pain and the gradual slipping away of everything he had barely begun to understand about the world. As darkness fell once more on what would likely be his final night, his legs finally buckled beneath him, his body collapsing into the dirt with a soft thud that sent a jolt of fresh agony through his weakened frame. The barbed wire, now slack in some places and biting deeper in others, creaked with his movement. The colt's eyes closed, his breathing so faint that even the nearby crickets seemed louder. The forest prepared to claim another secret, another story that would fade into its soil without witness or remembrance. Time seemed to blur as the young colt drifted between consciousness and a merciful darkness. The relentless sun beat down through the canopy, flies gathering around his wounds, the pain now a constant companion. He no longer had the strength to fight. His once alert ears now hung limply, his proud head drooping toward the earth that would soon claim him. With each labored breath, memories of open fields and his mother's protective presence faded like morning mist. The forest around him continued its indifferent rhythm. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, wind rustled through leaves, nature carrying on while a young life ebbed away forgotten and unseen. As darkness fell once more, the colt's legs finally buckled beneath him, the barbed wire cutting deeper as his body collapsed. The morning dew settled coldly against his skin, no longer registering as discomfort among the symphony of pain that consumed his existence. 3 days had passed since anyone had approached him, since harsh hands had wrapped that cruel metal around his legs and neck, binding him to this ancient oak with calculated precision. The forest had grown familiar with his suffering, a silent witness to humanity's darkness. Each sunrise brought less hope than the one before. Each sunset took with it another fragment of his fading strength. A gentle rain began to fall, droplets sliding through the leaves above, to splash against his dirt-matted coat. The water pooled around his collapsed form, mixing with blood to create pale crimson puddles that seeped into the thirsty ground. Nature reclaiming what was offered. The rain brought momentary relief, cooling his fever-hot skin and washing away the persistent insects that tormented his open wounds. He no longer had the energy to swish his tail against their invasion. The hunger had been unbearable at first, a gnawing emptiness that demanded attention. Now it had retreated to a distant hollow feeling, overshadowed by thirst that cracked his lips and coated his tongue with thick paste. The colt's body had begun consuming itself, drawing on final reserves of strength. In a biological battle, his conscious mind had already surrendered. His ribs pressed against skin, pulled taut over a frame made for running, for growth, for life, not for this slow surrender. As night descended once more upon the forest, the temperature dropped precipitously. The colt's breathing grew more labored, small clouds forming with each shallow exhale. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, its hunting cry, piercing the darkness. The sound penetrated the colt's fading awareness, a final connection to the world slipping beyond his reach. His heartbeat slowed, muscles relaxed, and something like peace settled over him. As consciousness retreated, the inevitable end approached, a release from suffering that seemed almost kind in its finality. The forest would keep his secret, his bones eventually becoming part of the earth, his suffering forgotten. All that remained was darkness, silence, and the endless night that promised no dawn. Michael Reeves never intended to be on this particular road, let alone venture into the woods beyond it. A wrong turn, followed by his truck's radiator giving out miles from the nearest service station, had left him stranded on a lonely stretch of backwoods highway. A retired veterinarian who'd spent decades healing animals only to retreat from the world after his wife's death, Michael now found himself following a barely visible deer trail, seeking a stream where he might collect water for his overheated vehicle. Irritation marked his weathered face as he pushed aside branches, cursing his misfortune and the malfunctioning GPS that had directed him down this abandoned road. Little did he know that this unwelcome detour would lead him to an encounter that would shatter his carefully constructed isolation. The woods closed around him like a living thing, branches reaching toward him with gnarled fingers, underbrush catching at his pants as if urging him to turn back. Michael pushed deeper, his weathered hands shoving aside the persistent vegetation. 5 years of solitude had hardened him, grief calcifying into a protective shell around what remained of his heart. The forest seemed to recognize this, meeting his bitterness with indifferent resistance. Sweat trickled down his temple, mingling with the scratch of a wayward thorn across his cheek. His boots sank into the soft earth, each step taking him further from the broken-down truck and deeper into territory unmarked on any map. The rational part of his mind insisted he was being foolish, that no water was worth wandering this far from the road, but something pulled him onward. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, a trait his wife had both loved and lamented. Catherine would have called this another one of his impulsive wanderings, her voice gentle with exasperation and fondness, the memory cut sharper than any thorn. The forest grew denser, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the afternoon sunlight. Shadows stretched and deepened around him, distorting ordinary shapes into mysterious forms. The distant sound of running water beckoned him forward, promising relief for his overheated radiator, if not for his parched soul. Michael checked his phone. No signal. As expected in these forgotten woods, he was truly alone, cut off from the world he'd already withdrawn from by choice. As he pushed through a particularly thick stand of undergrowth, the trees suddenly gave way to a small clearing. Michael paused, catching his breath, surveying the unexpected open space. Something felt wrong here. The air heavier somehow, charged with a lingering energy he couldn't name. His veterinarian's instincts, dormant for years but never truly forgotten, stirred to life. The clearing wasn't natural. Broken branches and trampled vegetation spoke of recent human presence. A chill ran down his spine despite the summer heat, some primal warning system activating in his gut. The water could wait. Something else demanded his attention now, pulling him toward the center of the clearing with the inexorable force of fate disguised as coincidence. The sound was so faint that Michael nearly missed it. A weak, rattling breath that didn't belong to any woodland creature he recognized. Following the sound with growing unease, he pushed through a dense thicket and froze, his blood running cold at the sight before him. The collapsed foal, barbed wire embedded in its flesh, lay in a clearing dappled with unforgiving sunlight that illuminated every cruel detail of its suffering. The deliberate nature of the act was unmistakable. This was no accident, no animal caught in forgotten farm fencing. The precision of the binding, the remote location. Someone had wanted this animal to suffer, to die slowly where no one would find it. Michael's hands trembled as decades of professional detachment crumbled, raw emotion flooding through him as he locked eyes with the dying colt, who somehow, impossibly, lifted his head at the human's approach. The world seemed to stop turning. In that moment, all sound fading away, except for the labored breathing of the wounded animal. Michael stood transfixed, his mind struggling to process the deliberate cruelty before him. The foal's coat, what should have been a gleaming chestnut, was now matted with dried blood and caked with mud. Where the barbed wire cut into flesh, angry red wounds festered with infection, some so deep they revealed glimpses of bone beneath. The precision of the binding was what disturbed Michael most. This was no random act, but something calculated, methodical in its cruelty. Years of veterinary training surged through Michael's consciousness, his clinical mind cataloging symptoms, even as his heart recoiled. Severe dehydration, infection likely septic, significant blood loss, tissue damage extensive. The prognosis would be grave, even in a fully equipped clinic, let alone here in the wilderness with nothing but his bare hands. The foal shouldn't even be conscious, yet those eyes, large, liquid pools of pain and fading awareness, fixed on Michael with something that cut through his carefully constructed walls of isolation. For 5 years, since Catherine's death, Michael had moved through life like a ghost, interacting with the world only when absolutely necessary. He had deliberately severed connections, retreated from the profession that once defined him, chosen solitude as a shield against further loss. Yet standing in this forgotten clearing, face to face with deliberate cruelty, something long dormant awakened within him. Anger surged through his veins, followed by a fierce protectiveness he thought he'd buried alongside his wife. The colt tried again to lift its head, the effort visibly draining what little strength remained. A soft, plaintive sound escaped its cracked lips, more exhale than vocalization. In that sound, Michael heard an echo of every patient he'd ever treated, every creature that had ever relied on his skilled hands for survival. Without conscious decision, he found himself dropping to his knees beside the wounded animal, his weathered hand hovering uncertainly above its matted coat. The moment stretched between them, man and beast, healer and wounded, both broken in different ways, both at a crossroads neither had anticipated. The colt's fear was palpable, his eyes rolling white with terror. As Michael slowly approached, every movement had to be calculated, every word whispered in the gentlest tone he could manage. Hours passed, as Michael inched closer, speaking continuously, eventually sitting just beyond the colt's reach, sharing the silent forest and establishing a fragile connection. When darkness began to fall and the temperature dropped, Michael made his calculated move, approaching with water-soaked cloths to cool the foal's fever-hot skin, his experienced hands working to assess the damage while building critical trust. The barbed wire had created a horrific puzzle that would require both technical skill and infinite patience to dismantle without causing further harm. Time stretched and compressed in the small clearing, minutes feeling like hours, as Michael settled himself on the forest floor, close enough to be present, but distant enough not to threaten. The colt's terror gradually gave way to exhaustion. His struggling ceased as strength failed him. Michael remained motionless, his voice a continuous soft stream of reassurance, the words themselves less important than their consistent, gentle cadence. The sun tracked slowly across the sky, shadows lengthening as Michael's patience outlasted the animal's fear. When the colt's breathing steadied into a less frantic rhythm, Michael reached into his pocket, extracting a small pocket knife and a bandana. Moving with deliberate slowness, he cut strips from his own shirt, then crawled to a nearby puddle, soaking the fabric. The foal flinched as Michael finally made contact, pressing the cool cloth against its fevered neck. That first touch, the bridge between terror and possible salvation, hung suspended between them like a fragile thread. The colt's muscles quivered beneath Michael's fingertips, but he didn't pull away. Working outward from that initial point of contact, Michael gradually mapped the extent of the damage. Each barbed twist had created its own nightmare of torn flesh and dried blood. The deliberate complexity of the binding revealed a disturbing level of premeditation. This hadn't been a hasty act, but a calculated one. Someone had wanted this death to be slow, painful, and hidden from the world. Bile rose in Michael's throat as his fingers traced the intricate pattern of cruelty, his medical mind struggling to formulate a plan, while his human heart raged at such calculated malice. As daylight faded, Michael retrieved his phone, activating its flashlight. The artificial glow cast harsh shadows across the clearing, making the colt's wounds appear even more grotesque. Working with painstaking precision, Michael began addressing the most immediately threatening sections of wire. Each careful touch was preceded by a gentle warning, each small success acknowledged with quiet praise. The colt's initial flinching gradually subsided, replaced by a wary acceptance born not of trust, but desperate necessity. Michael lost himself in the work, his world narrowing to the immediate challenges before him. This section of wire, this infected wound, this moment of connection. For the first time in 5 years, he existed fully in the present, all thoughts of his own pain temporarily eclipsed by the immediate needs of another living being. As night settled fully around them, man and horse remained locked in this delicate dance of rescue, neither fully trusting the outcome, but both somehow committed to seeing it through together. With surgical precision, Michael began the painstaking process of removing the barbed wire, each twisted strand presenting its own challenge. Blood coated his hands as he worked through the night, a small flashlight clenched between his teeth illuminating the gruesome task. The foal's occasional flinch or soft whimper tore at something long dormant in Michael's chest, awakening the compassion he'd buried alongside his wife's memory. By dawn, the last cruel strand fell away, but the victory felt hollow as Michael surveyed the weakened animal, now free but hovering perilously close to death. The most difficult challenge still lay ahead, somehow transporting this critically injured colt back to civilization where he could receive proper care, with no vehicle nearby and miles of rugged terrain between them and the road. The rusted barbs had created a sinister puzzle, each piece connected to the others in a way that made freedom impossible without human intervention. Michael worked with a focused intensity that had once made him renowned in veterinary circles, his fingers remembering skills his heart had tried to forget. The metal had embedded itself deeply in places, creating channels of infection that radiated heat against his fingertips. Each snip of the wire cutters represented both release and new danger, freedom from constraint, but risk of fresh bleeding, relief from pressure, but exposure of wounds to the forest air. Morning light began to filter through the canopy, revealing the full extent of what had been accomplished and what remained to be done. The colt lay free of his binding, but terrifyingly still, his breathing shallow, his once bright eyes glazed with exhaustion and fever. The circles of raw flesh, where wire had bitten deep, now bled freely, no longer constricted by the very thing that had caused the wounds. Michael's shirt, torn into makeshift bandages, did little to stem the flow. Freedom had come, but with it the sobering realization that liberation was only the first impossible step of many. The forest that had witnessed this cruelty now presented a new challenge, a labyrinth of uneven terrain, fallen logs, and thick undergrowth that stood between this dying animal and any chance of survival. Michael stood, his joints protesting after hours of crouched work, and surveyed their surroundings. His truck remained miles away, itself disabled and useless. No cell signal penetrated these woods. No convenient path offered itself to his desperate gaze. The colt could not walk. could barely lift his head. To abandon him now would render the night's effort meaningless. To stay meant accepting that both might perish here, undiscovered. Something shifted in Michael's expression as he looked down at the wounded animal. A hardening of resolve. A decision made not from calculation, but from a place long walled off within himself. With careful movements, he gathered the remains of his shirt, constructing a crude harness from strips of fabric. The colt watched through half-lidded eyes, too weak to resist as Michael worked the improvised straps beneath his body. Muscles that had atrophied during Michael's years of self-imposed isolation now tensed with renewed purpose as he prepared for what could only be described as an act of beautiful futility. One broken soul attempting to carry another toward an uncertain salvation, both transformed by the simple profound decision not to surrender to despair. Using his jacket to create a makeshift harness and his belt for a lead, Michael began the grueling journey back toward the road. Every step measured by the colt's fragile condition. The foal collapsed repeatedly, each time taking longer to rise. Michael's encouraging words becoming increasingly urgent, desperate. Halfway to the road, a sudden thunderstorm erupted, turning the forest floor to treacherous mud, the downpour washing fresh blood from reopened wounds. Michael abandoned all thoughts of his stranded truck, his sole focus becoming the next step, the next breath, the imperceptible nod of the colt's head, as he whispered, "Just a little further, buddy. Don't you give up on me now." As darkness fell for the second night, Michael sheltered the trembling animal beneath a rocky overhang, using his own body for warmth, refusing to acknowledge the growing possibility that they might both perish in these forgotten woods. The forest seemed to close in around them, ancient trees bearing silent witness to this strange procession of man and dying horse. Each step forward became a battle against nature itself, roots reaching up to trip weary feet, branches slapping against exhausted shoulders. The makeshift harness cut into Michael's skin, his muscles burning with effort, as he essentially carried the foal's weight. When the animal's strength failed, pain became a constant companion, acknowledged then dismissed. As Michael pushed beyond physical boundaries he thought long since established, rain pounded mercilessly from above, turning gentle slopes into treacherous slides of mud and debris. Michael lost his footing more than once, going down hard on one knee, teeth gritted against both pain and the temptation to surrender. The colt's breathing grew increasingly labored, his eyes rolling with fear at each crash of thunder. Blood from reopened wounds mingled with rain and mud, creating macabre patterns across the animal's once beautiful coat. Logic argued for abandonment, for self-preservation, but something deeper than reason propelled Michael forward. Beneath the rocky overhang, sheltered from the worst of the storm, Michael pressed his body against the shivering colt. The animal's fever burned against his skin, a disturbing contrast to his own rain-chilled flesh. Every shallow breath the foal took seemed like it might be the last, each exhale hanging in the chilled air before dissipating like a ghost. Sleep eluded Michael as he kept vigil, his hands constantly moving across the colt's neck, checking for pulse, for signs of worsening shock, for any indication that death was drawing nearer. The darkness seemed absolute, the forest's nighttime sounds muffled by the persistent drumming of rain. In this liminal space between hope and despair, Michael found himself whispering secrets he had shared with no one. Confessions of how he had retreated from life after Catherine's death, how he had chosen isolation over healing, how he had abandoned his calling out of fear that caring would only lead to more loss. The dying colt became both witness and absolution, neither judging nor forgiving, simply existing alongside him in this moment of raw vulnerability. Morning brought weak sunlight and renewed determination. The colt's eyes opened, reflecting something that might have been mistaken for trust. Michael adjusted the crude harness, his body protesting every movement as he prepared to continue their impossible journey. He had no illusions about their chances. The odds remained overwhelmingly against them. But as he carefully helped the foal to its feet, Michael understood that something fundamental had shifted within him. Whether they survived or not, he had already been transformed by the simple act of refusing to surrender to cruelty, to despair, to the easier path of walking away. When a local ranger discovered them the following morning, a mud-covered man cradling the head of a barely breathing colt, it set in motion a chain of events that would test both man and animal to their limits. Local veterinarians shook their heads at the colt's condition, infections raging through his system, weight dangerously low, wounds catastrophic. Prepare yourself, they warned Michael. Even with treatment, survival is unlikely. But something had awakened in Michael during those desperate hours in the forest, a fierce determination that had lain dormant since his wife's passing. Setting up camp beside the colt's stall, he maintained a constant vigil, cleaning wounds, administering medications, speaking continuously in the same gentle tone that had first earned the animal's trust. Days passed, then weeks, each small improvement celebrated, each setback fought with stubborn resolve, until the morning Michael entered the stall to find the young horse standing on his own, wounded but unmistakably alive. The sterile walls of the veterinary clinic created a stark backdrop for the drama unfolding within. The colt's body, now cleaned of forest grime, revealed the true extent of his ordeal. Deep gouges crisscrossed his legs and neck, infection blooming like poisonous flowers beneath his skin. The attending veterinarians moved with efficient precision, their expressions carefully neutral, as they assessed damage that would have killed most animals days ago. Their whispered consultations carried the unmistakable weight of professional pessimism, a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology and delivered with practiced compassion. Michael absorbed their prognosis with the same quieted intensity with which he had faced the barbed wire. He acknowledged their expertise without accepting their conclusion. When they offered humane euthanasia, he countered with questions about antibiotics, wound management, nutritional support. The younger veterinarians exchanged glances that spoke of pity, not just for the horse but for this haggard man who couldn't recognize the inevitable. Only the clinic director, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had witnessed thousands of animal histories, seemed to understand the unspoken pact between man and beast. The stall became Michael's world. He slept on a cot beside the colt, waking at the slightest change in breathing, the smallest sound of discomfort. His fingers, once skilled in the operating room, then numbed by years of disuse, regained their sensitivity as they cleaned wounds, changed bandages, administered medications. The staff grew accustomed to his presence, some admiring his dedication, others pitying what they perceived as misplaced hope. Few understood that each ministration wasn't just healing the animal, but rebuilding something vital within the man. Infections surged and receded like a merciless tide. The colt's fever spiked to dangerous levels, his thin body convulsing under Michael's watchful gaze. During one particularly harrowing night, the animal's breathing became so labored that 3 separate staff members suggested ending the suffering. Michael acknowledged their concern, but continued his work, his movements deliberate and focused, as if performing an intricate surgery rather than simply holding death at bay. Dawn broke with impossible grace on the 23rd day. Michael entered the stall with his usual quiet caution, preparing himself for whatever challenge the morning might present. The sight that greeted him froze him in place. The colt stood trembling on spindly legs, his eyes clear of fever for the first time since the forest. Something passed between them. In that moment, a recognition that transcended species. Neither was the same creature that had entered this sterile space weeks ago. Both had been broken. Both had refused the easier path of surrender, and both now stood at the threshold of something that could only be called rebirth. 6 months later, the scars remained visible. On the colt's body, silver lines mapping the history of his suffering. But they no longer defined him, renamed Phoenix, for the mythical bird that rises from ashes. The young horse now galloped across green pastures surrounding Michael's newly purchased small farm. The retired veterinarian had found purpose again, his isolated existence transformed by the bond forged through shared survival. The investigation into who had committed such cruelty continued, but Michael focused instead on the miracle unfolding daily before him, watching a creature who had known only pain learn to trust, to play, to live without fear. As the sun set on a warm summer evening, Phoenix approached the fence where Michael stood, willingly pressing his head against the man's chest in a gesture of complete trust. Two broken souls, found in the darkest of circumstances, now healing each other with each new day's light. The transformation had not been swift or easy. For weeks after Phoenix first stood in the clinic stall, setbacks threatened to undo their progress. Wounds reopened, nightmares seemed to plague the young horse, sending him into panicked states where his eyes rolled white with remembered terror. But Michael never wavered, his patience as constant as the sunrise. The same hands that had once performed delicate surgeries now ran gentle strokes along Phoenix's neck, brushing his coat until it gleamed with health, working muscle and tendon back to strength with methodical care. The small farm had come as a surprise, even to Michael himself. After living in a sparse apartment for years, hiding from memories of his former life, he had awakened one morning with absolute clarity. Phoenix needed space to heal, to run, to reclaim what had been stolen from him. Within weeks, Michael had liquidated investments untouched since Catherine's death, purchasing the modest property with its weathered barn and rolling meadows. Neighbors whispered about the strange pair, the solitary man and his scarred horse, but kept their distance, sensing something sacred in the quiet routine that unfolded behind the simple wooden fence. Spring yielded to summer, and Phoenix's gait changed from halting to fluid, his muscles rebuilding beneath a coat now glossy with proper nutrition and care. The haunted look in his eyes appeared less frequently, replaced by something cautious yet unmistakably curious. He approached new experiences with deliberate consideration rather than fear. The rustling of leaves, the bark of a distant dog, the gentle rainfall on the metal roof. Michael documented each milestone in a journal he had begun keeping, his physician's observations gradually giving way to more personal reflections. Authorities had traced the barbed wire to a shuttered farm 10 miles from where Phoenix had been found. The investigation continued, but justice seemed a hollow concept compared to the redemption Michael witnessed daily. Some wounds would never fully heal, some memories could never be erased, but their shared journey had revealed something profound. Resilience could transcend suffering, trust could be rebuilt from its shattered remains, and sometimes healing another was the surest path to healing oneself. As Phoenix lifted his head from Michael's chest, eyes clear and present in the moment, the past receded like shadows before dawn, leaving two survivors standing together in the lengthening light. Thank you for watching this incredible story of survival and second chances. If you found yourself moved by Phoenix's journey from darkness to light, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories of animal resilience and human compassion. I'll hope to see you in the next video.